Good morning and welcome to this March meeting of the Children and Family Scrutiny Board. My name is Councillor Alan Lamb. I represent the Wetherby Ward and I'm the chair of this board. We've got an awful lot to get through this morning, a packed agenda. We're doing things slightly differently, so all will become clear as we go through. As is our usual custom, I'm going to start by asking our board members to introduce themselves. So if I can go through in alphabetical order and start with Helen Bellamy, please.
Morning, I'm Helen Bellamy, teacher representative.
Thank you. Do we have Kate Blacker on the call yet?
Yes, good morning. Kate Blacker, primary parent governor representative.
Thank you. Tony Britton, please.
Tony Britton, representing Roman Catholic Diocese of Leeds.
Thank you. Councillor Drinkwater. Councillor Drinkwater, are you there? I've seen you.
Sorry, I'm just on the phone, Alan. You just give me a minute.
No problem. Councillor Flynn.
Good morning, Billy Flynn, Councillor for Adlam Wharfdale.
Celia Foote, please.
Good morning, Celia Foote, teacher representative.
Thank you. Councillor Forsyth.
Good morning, Councillor Anne Forsyth, Farnham Wortley Ward.
Thank you. Andrew Graham, please.
Good morning, Andrew Graham, representing the Church of England Diocese.
And then Councillor Caroline Gruen, please.
Good morning, everybody. Councillor Caroline Gruen, I represent Bramley and Stanningley Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Howley, please.
Good morning, Chris Howley, Councillor for Wheatwood Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Hussain, please. No, I think he's joining us a little later on. Councillor Illingworth.
Good morning, Councillor Illingworth from Kirksall Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Kidger, please.
Councillor Wynne Kidger, representing Morley South. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lennox.
Good morning, Councillor Jess Lennox, representing Crossgates and Winmore.
Thank you. Councillor Marshall Cattung, please.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Abigail Marshall Cattung, representing Little London, Woodhouse and the City Centre.
Thank you. Councillor Renshaw, please.
Good morning, Councillor Karen Renshaw, representing Owsley and Robin Hood Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Stevenson.
Morning, everybody. Ryan Stevenson from the Harewood Ward.
And finally, do we have Jackie Ward? I'm not sure if she's joined us yet, so hopefully she'll join us shortly. So, well, thank you, everyone, and welcome. If I can also ask our two key support officers to introduce themselves. So, Angela Brogden first.
Morning, everyone. Angela Brogden, Principal Scrutiny Advisor.
Thank you. And then Harriet Spate, please.
Good morning, everyone. Harriet Spate, Governance Officer.
Okay, thank you very much. The theme of this morning's meeting is looking at the long-term impact of the coronavirus pandemic on children and young people, which I'm sure everyone will agree is a really, really important piece of work for us to do, and also to look at some of the ways that we might be able to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. We've got a very large number of participants this morning coming to give us evidence, and we're going to approach the meeting in a slightly different way to normal. So we have people grouped. So we've got a few contributors around education, some around health and well-being, representatives from the youth service, and then really importantly, later on in the morning, we've got a group of young people from the Youth Council coming themselves to talk to us about their experiences and thoughts. So we will go through section by section. There'll be a short introduction from each group, and then we'll go into questions and answers from board members. We'll have a short introduction at the start from Sal Tariq, the Director of Children's Services. Because there are so many contributors, rather than going around everybody now, I'm just going to ask people to introduce themselves at the start of each section. But if I could ask, if they're on the call, Councillor Pryor and Councillor Verner just to introduce themselves, and there'll be opportunity for them at the end, along with Sal and his leadership team, when we're summing up and looking at next steps and actions following on from the session. So Councillor Pryor, please.
Morning, everyone. So I'm Councillor Jonathan Pryor. I'm the Executive Member for Learning, Skills and Employment. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Verner?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Councillor Fiona Verner. I'm the Cabinet Member for Children and Families and Adult Social Care.
Okay, thank you both. Good to have you with us. And thank you also to everybody else who's on the call. We'll welcome you as we go along and get to your section, but I'm grateful for those that are staying and joining us for the whole meeting. So what I am going to ask of board members is, because we've got a lot of contributors to get through, and it's really important that we hear from our witnesses and they have the maximum opportunity to get across the things they want to say, that we really focus on short, snappy questions. So there'll be a brief introduction. If you use the hand raising function, so I can see that you'd like to ask a question. I don't normally do this, but it is important that we get through each section in time. So I will use the mute function if you're going on for more than sort of 30 seconds or a minute, so we can actually move to the answer. I'll get round as many first questions from everyone as possible, and then we'll go around again if there's still time. So if you just keep them really focused and to the point, and if I can encourage answers to be reasonably brief as well. Angela, were you waving your hand at me? Or?
Sorry, Chair. I appreciate it. I realise it was in relation to item 7, but obviously it's in terms of the minutes items as well first, please, Chair.
Yeah. Oh, don't panic, Angela. I haven't forgotten. So without further ado, we will move to the agenda before Angela shouts at me. So item 1, are there any appeals, please, Harriet?
No appeals, Chair.
Thank you. Item 2, do we have to exclude the public from any items?
There are no exempt items today, Chair.
Thank you. Are there any late items?
No late items.
Thank you. Item 4, are there any declarations of disclosable pecuniary interests? Harriet, any members, any interest to declare? No. Item 5, any apologies, please?
Thanks, Chair. Apologies have been received today from Councillor Biffle and co-opted members Debbie Riley and Callum Dixon. Thanks.
Thank you. Item 6, if we can, first of all, approve the minutes of our last meeting, which was the 3rd of February. Are we happy to approve those minutes, please? I'm seeing a flurry of nods. Yep, thank you very much. And are there any matters arising anyone wishes to raise that we're not discussing on the agenda? No, I'm not seeing any hands going up. So with that, we can move on to item 7, which is our opportunity to look at the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on children and young people in Leeds. As I've said, there's a lot of contributors to get through, and we're going to start with a brief introduction to the report, which you'll all have read from Sal, and then we're going to move on to the education section, and we'll have 20 minutes on that. So Sal, for a maximum of 5 minutes, please, if you'd just like to introduce the report and the session for us, please.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Councillor Lem, and good morning, everybody. My name is Salim Tarek. I'm Director of Children and Families here in Leeds. I will keep it brief. I just want to say a few things to kick us off. I guess the restrictions and lockdowns have had a major impact on our ability for schools to remain open for all children. And children's normal routines and learning have been significantly impacted upon. We don't know quite yet what that impact is going to look like, and as we prepare for a full return to schools from next week, we will start to see the reality of the impact that it's had on children's social, emotional, mental health needs will be significant. As will, I think it's important to remember, as will their need for friendship, play and physical activity, because that has been impacted upon during this period of time. The early years sector has also seen a really significant impact from the pandemic, with businesses struggling financially and long-term sustainability being affected. Again, as we return to work and to school over the coming months, we'll start to see the reality of what that means for the sector, and it will be important for us to support the sector to try and get back on its feet again. Schools and early year settings coming back will inevitably lead to us seeing children again in a way that we haven't for quite a significant period of time, and I think that could have that will raise a significant level of need for our early health prevention and social care services, our youth services, youth justice services, in fact, as well. I think some of the major impacts will be around youth unemployment. We know there's been a significant impact on retail and hospitality, and young people are quite often involved in that as part of their employment. So I think youth unemployment will be significant. Poverty, we know, is going to impact families significantly, and all of these factors kind of play into services not having been able to operate at the level that they would have, and with children not in school and not in early years settings in the same way as they have been previously. There may well be quite a lot of unseen longer term neglect, potentially abuse of children and young people. We know that there's been significant pressures on families. Family dysfunction has been higher, and domestic violence, we've seen an increase in that. So that, along with potential civil disobedience, really puts a significant pressure on the system, particularly when we look at children, young people and their families. We've reported regularly to this board in terms of how we've been responding across the system in terms of managing the ongoing pandemic, but today I think is an opportunity for us to take stock, have a look at some of the issues that are going to impact longer term, but also to look at the response system-wide. I think it's probably record-breaking in terms of the number of people that we've brought along to scrutiny today, but I think that's an indication of the level of response that's required from right across the system, and I'm hopeful that today we'll not only air some of the challenges that we've got, but also start to look at what that response is like from across the system, not only how we've managed it, but as Councillor Lamb said at the outset, really looking into what the longer term impacts will be. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sal. That's a really good introduction for us. So the first section we're going into is around education. So we have with us Karen Jessup, Stephen Roos and Erica Hjorns. So if I could ask the three of you to introduce yourselves, then a maximum 5 minutes of introduction, however you want to do it, whether one person's taking the lead or you're going to share it. And then there are two questions which we'd really like to focus on. So the first is what you regard to be the potential long-term impacts of COVID-19 on young people in Leeds from your perspective in your service area, and what you would prioritise as actions to help to mitigate that. So if I can hand over to the three of you, and then I'll start watching out for people with questions, and we'll go into question and answer after that. So it's over to you to introduce and give us your thoughts, please.
So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Karen Jessup, I'm Principal Educational Psychologist, and I lead the SEND support teams in Children and Families. Steve?
Hi, morning everyone. Steve Roos, Health and Wellbeing Service, deputising on behalf of Sarah Mumtaz Jones, the lead for the Health and Wellbeing Service.
Hello, I'm Erica Hyan, Senior Secondary School Improvement Advisor.
So we'll give you a couple of minutes each of what we think, so you get a bit of flavour in terms of. So if I just start, we know there's an impact on children and people on their young person's development, their holistic development, and we understand and we know that social issues that have occurred during the pandemic are going to play out within the school setting, and we're predicting, as you wouldn't be surprised, that will have a greater impact on young people who've got a special educational need disability, social emotional mental health needs, and those who are disadvantaged. So at the moment, we have got some predictions around what is going to happen, and there are some certain thematics coming through where you can see there are some young people who are being more affected by this than others. And we've got some year groups even within that where there is more impact than others. And there are some more immediate impacts for them, especially those young people who have got, for example, in those older year groups, year 10s and year 11, that are moving on to the post-16 world, and where they have had a significant proportion of their time recently out of school. We also recognise there are certain aspects around those young people who don't significantly impacted, who don't traditionally use services, those sorts of populations who were disadvantaged before, and where that will be playing out in things like persistent absenteeism that schools will have to manage, and some of those other thematics around mental health. And just from our services, before I hand on to Steve in our whistle-stop tour, I suppose we're having to take, because we recognise there's going to be quite a significant pressure on services to respond at both the statutory end for education, health and care plans, where we predict people will be requesting more because of concerns about missed schooling and lack of progress, but also in the early help. So we're having to take quite a systems approach and doing a lot of targeting towards populations and putting our staff connecting across children and families. So, for example, targeting staff and working together within the early help hubs, with youth justice services, with signpost, with our children looked after virtual school services, and doing things that are on a more populations approach. Steve?
Okay, thanks, Karen. I'm here, Chair, to talk today really about the wellbeing surveys. So what you'll see in the report from 3.7.6 to 3.7.8, pages 26 to 29, is what we think represents the headline data from the early years survey, the parent carers survey, and the pupils survey. And I'm sure that some of the findings members will already be familiar with from the national conversation. When members consider survey findings, I would like to add a note of caution to guard against broad generalisations, not least because our results currently represent only a small proportion of Leeds schools and settings. So take the early years survey, for example. We've so far had responses from less than a fifth of primary schools and just 16% of nurseries. The pupil surveys currently have responses from 12% of primary schools and just 5% of our secondary schools. So we also need to be mindful about when the survey findings were collated. Considering that the surveys launched to schools on the 15th of June last year, the actual time range we're looking at when schools were able to complete as a result of the ongoing disruption to the school calendar is just a total of 12 weeks over a time period of 9 months. Very little, if any, of which will have been a full school complement. I don't think members need to be reminded of the challenges schools have faced since March 2020, but the phrase "every day is a snow day" is both a common and frequently heard statement from schools. The collated latest survey findings are posted on our school wellbeing website each half term, for which I can provide a link subsequent to the meeting for members. In turning to what I consider to be the priority actions going forward, the first thing I want to say is that we need to continue to listen to the voices of our children and young people about their well-being and implement effective mechanisms for leadership teams to be kept aware of emerging issues. I also think it would be prudent to identify dedicated capacity to effectively and regularly analyse wellbeing survey responses and report appropriately. Currently, my team have capacity to collate results every 6 weeks. Neither myself nor any of my team colleagues are trained data analysts or qualified statisticians. And finally, again, with unfortunately my cautionary hat on, I think that we do need to guard against over-catastrophizing. And by that, I don't mean in any way to downplay or trivialise the consequences that the pandemic has had on the life chances of some of our exam cohort, for example, some of which you will no doubt hear more on later this morning from the Leeds Youth Council. What I do mean, however, is that our children and young people are resilient. The pupil survey found that around a half of children and young people surveyed reported no change to their mental health during lockdown, with a quarter reporting an improvement and another quarter reporting a worsening. No doubt it will be different once findings from the current lockdown start to come through. And to that extent, I agree with Sal, it's still too early to tell. but I would urge in all circumstances that we be guided in our response by what the data is telling us alongside school knowledge and experience of their pupils. Thank you. Erica.
Yeah, good morning. So as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of research at the moment being published, which is trying to quantify the amount of lost learning that's taken place during lockdown. And last week, there was a report from the EPI and Renaissance Learning organisations that looked at lost learning from the first lockdown, so basically March through to September. And it suggested that the average reading loss was between 1.7 and 2 months in primary, and similar rates for year 8 and year 9 in secondary. It suggested that 3 months of lost learning had taken place in maths in primary and secondary, and that regionally there were regional differences, and the Yorkshire and Humber region, the differences were greater, the lost learning was greater, so it suggested a loss of 2.8 months for reading in primary and secondary. And then really importantly, that schools with a high percentage of disadvantaged pupils saw greater amounts of learning loss. So 3 months for reading compared to 0.5 for schools with low numbers of disadvantaged pupils. So you can see some of the challenges ahead of us. To address this, we're focusing on 3 main areas. The first is the curriculum, so supporting teachers and leaders to focus on the absolute key concepts that aid progression. So if I think about my subject, which in the old days was French, early language learners absolutely need to understand, for instance, the concept of verbs declining, regular and irregular verbs, and of tenses as a baseline if they're going to be able to understand and then use the present, past and future tenses. So that means paring away all the non-essentials and making sure those key concepts are really embedded. The second aspect is developing expert assessment in the classrooms so that teachers really understand what pupils know, what they know securely, and the misconceptions that they've developed from their remote learning offer. And by assessment, I don't mean testing pupils. I mean using the craft of the teacher to work out who understands what I'm saying, planning lessons so that key concepts are revisited if needed and embedded, and working out if there's something that a pupil hasn't totally grasped. And I think the final key aspect to recovery is an unremitting focus on reading. And that is making sure that all pupils are proficient in decoding words, that they can read them, and then they develop into fluent readers so that reading is not a barrier to learning. And that in fact, it's the gateway to more learning and to catch up and independent work. So if you like, that's the universal offer, which all children should receive. There are various government schemes, such as the National Tutoring Programme, which we put details about in the report that went to you, which can help provide more small group and individual catch-up once specific gaps in learning have been identified. And to finish with, I think actually we should also think about the positive long-term aspects of COVID on pupils' learning. So I would say one particular aspect has been the widespread use of remote education. So leaders in the city see this as a real success and are keen to carry it on. So that, for instance, could be revision modules for pupils in the run-up to exams, or for instance, a blended learning offer for school refusers to encourage them back into full-time learning on site. So I hope that gives you an overview, and I'm happy to answer further questions.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. That was really helpful. So we're going to questions. Just a reminder for members to try and keep the questions as brief as possible. I'm happy to take questions from any of the contributors on the call. So if there are others, even if you're not regular board members and there was something you felt compelled to ask, then please pop your hand up and I'll get round as many people as I can. So we're starting with Councillor Renshaw, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask if there's any specific reason schools are going back full time, but the youth service who had a Youth Matters group that were already tackling children with social and emotional needs and giving that added support to. Is there some reason why they cannot meet up, or is it just that within the government plan it's not slithered in?
Might we be best saving
that
one? Should we ask? You're welcome to respond, but we do have a section on the youth service coming up.
Right. Okay.
So
okay.
I don't want to hang fire until Vicky takes part. So do you have any quick comments, Erica, Steve, or Karen?
I was just going to say that one of the things that is in place at the moment in a systems approach is that we have a wellbeing for education plan, which is DFE funded, and it links in with a lot of the stuff from the Anna Freud Centre to support schools to be that first point of contact and to support some of those peer relationships and social emotional needs. It's not taken away from the other services that can provide support as well, but there's a lot of work going into making sure that every child, young person who's going into school has got a school that really understands the needs of children following the pandemic and is offering that universal, strong service first.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Celia is next, please.
Thank you, Chair. The National Tutoring Programme, I believe it's using large private companies. How, or is it possible for you as local authority officers to be able to influence what they can contribute to the schools and the priorities that the local authority have identified?
I think the tutoring works very much on a one-to-one or small group basis. So I suppose what I outlined is what I call the universal offer, which is what schools need to do for all pupils so that they can then hone down into finding what the gaps in knowledge are, which could be of a whole class or the majority of the class, in which case you reteach, you revisit. But the National Tutoring Programme will be very much looking at the specific gaps in knowledge of specific pupils, and yes, that would be guided by the school. It would be the school that would be saying you need to work on this particular aspect with these pupils because that's what they don't know.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got Councillor Gruen next, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask Erica, the comments that you made about the difference between disadvantaged and advantaged in terms of reading loss, that sounds to me like parental support issue, perhaps. Do you, I mean, I hope we don't find ourselves in this position ever again, but should we, do you think we've learned any lessons that we might be able to do something differently in terms of advice and support for parents, for example?
Absolutely. I think there are ways in which we can encourage parents to read with their children or access reading with their children. We are going to run, well, there's the summer reading challenge, which runs every summer, but we're going to run that in conjunction with the Chief Librarian this year to make it much more well publicised and focused on, and we're going to look at take 10 particular pilot schools as well and engage with them more in a more structured way over the summer reading challenge to see if we can get participation and not just participation but completion from all children who are in that school. And those 10 pilot schools will also be undertaking something called the Reception Readers Star project, which is the brainchild of the Chief Librarian, and it's a great idea, which is for reception children coming into primary school. And we're going to launch that at the day. It could be virtually, it could be in person, depending on the circumstances, but we're going to launch that on the day that children, that the parents and the children come in to see their school for the first time, or and have that parents meeting, normally in the summer term. And the idea is to tell them about the 6 books, those 6 books, the specific 6 books to read, they will be a combination of a classic story, a fairy tale, a counting book, looking at themes such as diversity, rhythm and rhyme books, and then encouraging those children to read those books over the summer. And we'll make videos available so that parents can support that as well. So that we're trying to encourage that early reading, which I think is absolutely key. And I think that's probably what you were getting at, Councillor Groen, actually trying to encourage good habits of reading, going to the library. So that's just one of the things that we're looking at. I think you're absolutely right. And it's something that we need to focus on.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you for that. So I've got Councillor Forsyth next, please.
Thank you very much. A very quick question. Obviously, you've got some very good plans going forward. Is this all seen as all school-based education, or have you considered using other facilities? I noticed the youth service have said how important it is just getting young people to be out there with the sort of exercising and in the fresh air and everything else. I just wondered whether, if there's a more relaxed curriculum, that would be whether it's possible to consider that as an option.
Do you mean not having such a focus on, say, academic learning when pupils first go back?
I mean that have an offer where some of the education is actually based outside of school and allowed a much more relaxed approach. The education can still be, the reading can still be, you know, put into that, but perhaps, you know, especially in the summer term.
Yeah, I think there are 2 things there. One, that there is some funding that's going to be made available for schools to run summer schools. We don't quite know what that's going to look like yet, but we anticipate that those summer schools will not be totally focused on learning, that there'll be a lot of sort of experimental outside type learning, which is what I think you're alluding to. In terms of the curriculum when pupils return, I think a lot of schools are actually doing a sort of phased approach of the return. And I mean, I'm sure, I mean, Karen may want to comment on this, but and Steve as well, but some of the schools we know are doing a big focus on mental health, well-being, on learning behaviours when the pupils first come back, and actually paring down what they look at. We had a great presentation yesterday from a primary head who's got a new curriculum that she's calling Reignite.
Re-engage.
Thank you. And what was the third one, Dave?
Let's say reinvent. I can't.
Yeah, re-engage. So the 3 R's are different 3 R's from the ones that we're traditionally used to. But the idea was to actually just have a bit of fun and engaging love of learning again. And I think most schools are taking that kind of sensible approach.
Can I just quickly on the back of Erica, I think Councillor Forsyth, schools are really keen to get out and about. So we had a discussion yesterday about sort of school trips, school visits, residentials, all those sort of activities. One of the key things is there's still considerable health and safety risk assessments at the moment, but I think very much in the forefront of our school leaders' mind is to get the kids out into sort of those exciting opportunities again, because that's what they need. So I think as soon as they can, they will be taking their learning to that sort of like exciting, interesting level.
I was just going to say that quite a lot of the evidence bases that came out a long time ago, it feels like in the pandemic, was about the recovery curriculum and guarding against that rush back to formal learning. Because there are these gaps, and actually think about learning in the wider sense, because we shouldn't be, educators are not trying to offer some awe and wonder at the beginning so we can get on with teaching. What they're trying to do is to bring children, young people back into a system and take some of the learnings out of this and actually start looking at some of the curriculum aspects, like you say, and being much clearer about how young people engage in education, not just the thing that they're doing. So there's a lot of stuff about the recovery curriculum, whether it's 3 R's, we love alliteration in Leeds, don't we? Whether it's the 3 R's or whether it's others. PACE is another one that you'll see, and they're all pretty much based in those sorts of attunement and relational type approaches.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So the final question on this section is going to be from Helen. And so if in answering this, Karen, Stephen and Erica, if you've got any final thoughts as well, and then we'll need to move on from this section. So Helen, please.
Thank you. I've got two quick questions. One is, has there been any thought given to meeting time between class teachers and the tutors from the tutoring programme? Because I think that is really key, that those two people meet, and that would get more, achieve more success with the children's learning with the catch up. And then my other one, actually, in fact, it evades me. I did have another question, but I can't recall it at the moment. So I'll just stick with that one at the moment.
Okay, if it comes back to you, stick your hand back up, Helen.
I will do. Thank you.
I mean, what you say is absolutely good practice. I'll just follow that up and make sure that good practice is taking place.
Can I just say about the tutors? Oh, sorry.
No, carry on.
I was just going to say about the tutors as well, that actually that's one of those formal learning opportunities. We've got huge numbers of children, young people with different types of SEN and who are disadvantaged, where additional tutoring is not necessary. It's one of the approaches for some populations, but there are some aspects around that where they might not respond to that in the same way. So I think it's about having that really clear, individualized approach and understanding the populations that you have, so that we don't further advantage the advantaged and disadvantage the disadvantaged. So there's a lot of work to be done around that still.
Go for it, Helen, really quickly.
Yeah, it was just around, I totally agree, Karen. And just to say around, I was involved in family learning maybe 7 or 8 years ago, where we worked with children and their parents, and I taught the parents, various games and ways to teach the children and engage them, and that was really, really useful. And then we got together with the children after, and I just saw some real positive effects on parents' attitude to learning, their relationships with their children, and I just wondered if that's anything that's been thought of this time.
Being more based in secondary, I'm not sure. I don't know if Dave knows that. I will certainly follow it up.
I think there's been examples of that, for example, in early years when we're having a look at the 2-year-old curriculum and the 3-year-old, and actually instead of having 2-year-olds being able to come into the children's centres delivering support to the boxes, play boxes to families, and trying to encourage some of those things. I absolutely agree with you. I think there is definitely some more work to be done. I think schools, you'll find some schools doing some really creative things around that to try and engage families into learning as well. And actually, some of it is about reducing the anxiety of all families and all parents and carers around this, because there's huge anxiety that their child has missed out and that they have not caught up. And anxiety often turns into pressure. So there's a big piece of work to actually support families and children and people to understand actually they have not lost something. This is not irrecoverable for them. That there is a whole system of support around them, and we need that hope for families and for children and people. But absolutely, we probably need to do more, but there are some fantastic examples of that already that need to be increased.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. I can see you've got your hand up. Perhaps if you could hold on to your thoughts until we do the summing up at the end, because we need to move on to the next section, if that's okay. So if I can thank Karen, Stephen and Erica very much indeed. It's been really helpful. I know it's very quick, but a big part of this is for us looking at other areas we want to explore in more detail. And those comments have been really helpful from you. So thank you very much. And you're more than welcome to stay for the rest of the session and chip in with questions if you have them as well. So we're moving on now to look at the impacts from the perspective of health and well-being. So we've got 4 contributors. So if I could ask just quickly to introduce yourselves, and then same format, I'll give you 5 minutes by way of introduction, and then we'll go into quick questions and answers. So we have Dr. Jane Mashenko, please.
Jane's fine. Jane Mashenko, Strategic Lead Commissioner for the CCG for Children and Maternity Services.
Okay, and I think we have Janice Burberry. Are you there,
Hi,
Janice?
yes, I am. Sorry, trouble in meeting. Hi, good morning. Janice Burberry, Head of Public Health, Children and Families Team with the City Council.
Brilliant. Thank you for joining us. Catherine Ingold.
Hi, I'm Catherine Ingold, consultant in public health, working for the Children and Families team.
Thank you. And then finally, Lindsay Mortimer, please. Oh, you've just remuted yourself, Lindsay.
Remuted myself. Service delivery manager for Family First, responsible for the early help and stronger families.
Thank you. And just a comment from Councillor Illingworth has asked if you could give page references if there's something in the report that you're referring to. That would be helpful to members. So I'll hand over to Jane, and then I'm sure you'll lead us through, and then we'll go into questions as soon as you're ready to go.
Okay, so I've just got a few key points that I'd like to make before handing over to colleagues. So just particularly in terms of social, emotional, mental health, I guess is the focus really in terms of the impact of the pandemic. And there's a few points I'd like to make. So we know that after the initial reduction in referrals for mental health services happened in the first lockdown, that they have risen and are actually now higher than they were this time last year. And they are anticipated to rise again, of course, as pupils return to school.
Sorry to interrupt, Jane. Could you possibly move a bit closer to your microphones? A couple of members are just struggling to hear. No problem.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Just shout up a bit.
Okay. Okay. So yes, so referrals are already rising to higher than they have been before for mental health services, and they're anticipated to rise again as people return to school. So one of the things that I guess Janice might pick up on is one of the things we don't know the impact on yet is the impact on babies and toddlers. So we tend to focus all our conversations on children and young people, but if you think of the proportion of time that infants, babies and toddlers have been in the pandemic, there's a real unknown about that kind of social isolation, the reduction in social interaction and what that will have on them and their normal development. So that's a concern, and particularly if isolation and experience of the mum has been low, then that impacts on the infant's well-being as well. So very conscious of that, but it's a little bit of an unknown. One of the things we definitely know is that those with existing mental health conditions have had an escalation of need. So those who are already struggling with their mental health, because of the prolonged nature of the pandemic, and particularly for those going through critical transition points in terms of their school and development, then that's impacted. So there's more anxiety, there's increased complexity. Sometimes they've accessed services later when they're in more crisis, particularly nationally and locally. Eating disorders has risen in terms of both numbers and complexity. And of course, as we've been talking throughout this, and I guess throughout the whole of this session, we'll be referring to those children and young people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences, which is then amplified if they're living in adverse community environments, and the impact of the pandemic on them as well. So very conscious of that group and the hidden need within that group too, and the real need to kind of identify and work together to support those children and families. And we're very conscious of increased loss, whether that's loss of rituals such as transitioning out of high school, etc., not having the usual prom, the usual kind of peer engagement that you would have, and loss of bereavement, increased bereavement as well, and the impact that has on children, young people, family dynamics. In terms of kind of priorities, we've had a big session here, haven't we, talking about Future in Mind strategy. In our refresh of that strategy, which I'll emphasize again, is a partnership strategy. The only way we can help with this is by working together. So we're refreshing that partnership strategy about children and young people's mental health and well-being, very cited on the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic and what for each of the priorities, what we need to do in relation to that. So we had a full discussion the last time I came to this board about that and the plans in place. And then the other area that I'd like to kind of flag is our development together as a partnership in responding to those children and families where there are adverse childhood experience and community environments, and how do we really identify early and support early and work together as a system. And we're doing that together as a partnership. And I think it's really exciting and essential work. So those are the things I wanted to flag.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Did any of your colleagues want to come in now, or should we go straight to questions?
Go to Janice and Catherine.
Yeah. I'm happy to say a little bit about the James talking about the social, the impact of social distancing and development, and as you highlighted, Jane, there isn't a great deal of evidence around that out there, but I think we've got a big longitudinal study of around 600 children underway at the minute. And, it's involved asking parents about the time that they spent doing enriching activities with their children, how much screen time the children had during and before lockdown. And what we got was we had a lot of our families saying that they did a lot more with their children during lockdown, but actually these increases weren't spread equally across families. So, during lockdown, but not before lockdown, disadvantaged parents, those on low incomes, education, occupational status, living in more deprived neighbourhoods, were less likely to engage in enriching activities. And in particularly, they spent less time doing activities like reading and things that they could do outside with their kids as well. So there are concerns, I feel, that, obviously, and we've heard it through other contributors, that, this impact of COVID in the longer term isn't being equally felt across families, and that, children's experience of COVID and the long economic tail that we're going to see out of the back of that is going to really exacerbate our current sort of health inequalities. And we haven't got a great deal of time this morning, but, I think if we went through each of the different sort of the areas of concern with health, and I could use the example of obesity, for example, we are seeing slightly increased rates of obesity amongst our children and young people from the latest data, although we don't have great data about what's happened post-lockdown as yet, obviously, but we're seeing that it's our more disadvantaged children who are impacted the most. So I think that's really, really important to maintain and keep in our heads over this period of time.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, over to you.
I suppose I echo what Jane and Janice have said. I think also we need to give consideration to the anxiety raised by COVID. We know that the direct impact of COVID on children is very low compared to that of adults in terms of sickness, hospitalisation and death, but the indirect impacts are absolutely huge. The challenge that has been faced in delivering preventative services, the pressure that people have spoken about on families in terms of employment, juggling, stress, bereavement, poverty, domestic violence, and that's been unequally felt across children in Leeds. So I suppose they're the things that I would like to highlight. In the short term, we need to keep community COVID rates down. They will drive transmission in schools, not the other way around. So in the short term, it's such an important message to give. And in the long term, we need to get our preventative services back on track with a focus on children living in the most deprived areas of Leeds.
Okay, thank you. And then Lindsay, anything from you to start with?
Yeah, so I'll try not to repeat myself because the other comments really echo a lot of what I was going to say this morning. The hubs, I'm not sure if everybody is aware of the hubs, but they're multidisciplinary teams based within early health across the city. And they have within them mental health coordinators along with other coordinators. I think what's really important is that we take a think family work family approach, which means looking at the whole family, because any mental health impact on children is going to affect their carers, and any impact on carers is going to affect children. So I think it's really important that we see that as a whole and apply a think family work family approach. There are many common themes in terms of the mental health coordinators work since the pandemic began. There has most definitely been an increase in the need for their support and for direct interventions. I think some of the themes which have already been mentioned are around the pressures that parents put themselves under when they're homeschooling, that they worry about, not doing a good job and that the children are going to fall behind. There are clearly there are also links with domestic violence and abuse and with substance misuse, some of which is more hidden because we're not able to visit people as we ordinarily would, and children are not in schools. And there's also some things around the high rise in anxiety across the board, really, for people who are either shielding, who are homeschooling, and other people who previously haven't necessarily had any mental health difficulties, but who now don't have any distractions from some of their maybe traumatic experiences that they've had before, and so those are sort of coming to the surface for people. I think in terms of the impact on young people within early help services, we also have kinship arrangements that now fall under early help, and for many young people they haven't been able to have the family time that they would previously have. Many carers have been shielding, they haven't been able to get the support of respite that they would ordinarily get. So I think that's just an example of some of those added pressures that we need to be aware of. I think in terms of planning for the future, I agree that in some respects we don't know what the future will look like. Lots of families are very resilient. Lockdown has in some senses brought some positives for some people. I think digital exclusion is something that we need to be very much aware of, particularly for families where it may not be their first language, and that can be an added barrier in terms of people accessing the support that they need. But there's a lot of good work in terms of partnership working that has come about really by the need for us to respond to the needs of families. I think there are opportunities for us to seek funds if there are particular areas that we want to invest in. In particular, there has been some really good work done with providing counselling to families who are in need within the city, and that has had a fantastic uptake, which I think evidences that there is a need for those services and people are wanting those services. In terms of the impact of homeschooling and isolation, poverty, increased unemployment, the impact of grief and loss, I think we will see the impact of that as time goes on, and we will continue to develop positive working relationships with our colleagues in CAMS, and May, and in health and education. And one of the things we're trying to do is use family group conferencing as a way to bring family members together, particularly around some of those issues around grief and loss, which we've seen some really positive outcomes with. There's very much need for us to be creative in terms of our response to families. Using digital devices to support families when there are mental health difficulties, I think has been a barrier, and we've really had to be quite creative in going for walks with them, making sure we're doing it safely, but really trying to provide that support that they need, because the digital way of doing that doesn't always work for everybody. And I think finally, just two very points. First of all, is that our clusters provide emotional wellbeing support and counselling to young people. And I think they've seen a high take-up of that. And each cluster has a link person at Mindmate Spa and good links with CAMS, which is really positive. And I think there's also something around consultation with our communities and our families to understand from their perspective, their experience of the pandemic, understanding what's been helpful to them, their communities, what they would see as being helpful and supportive in the future.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, so we're going to questions. We haven't got masses of time for questions on this section, so we'll have to be particularly quick on the questions and the answers. And if I can go to Councillor Brent first, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to quickly ask how the mental health issues are going to be addressed. As previously we've discussed in Scrutiny Board about the length of time for CAMS, but obviously there's going to be a big impact, not only on the people who were previous having mental health issues, but on the added ones that will now be incorporated into that. I just wondered if there were any plans in place of how we can address that, and how schools and early years settings are going to be able to tackle the mental health issues coming on board.
Okay, thank you. Who's best placed to pick that up, please? Jane.
I'll pick up a little bit. So I think that we did cover quite a bit of this the last time I came, and we talked about the future in mind and the impact of the pandemic, and Jess had a slide that she shared in relation to additional investment that had gone in recognition of the need to meet the additional needs that was coming through due to the pandemic and the COVID, etc. So there has been work with clusters and CAMS in relation to that to address backlogs that had happened because of the first lockdown, where there was a pause before things reset. The offer is very much a blended offer, so they are maximising using digital where it's both appropriate and acceptable to children, young people and families, but also blending that with face-to-face when they want face-to-face. We're still waiting to see the exact impact in terms of demand. So as I said, we predict there will be increased need, and we're monitoring that really closely. But we're also working really closely with our colleagues and partners who Karen has already talked about, all the work that has been provided in terms of help and support to schools, the health and wellbeing service, the educational psychology service, so that school settings, you know, their response and their whole system response to the child is a tremendous benefit for their resilience, and being able to access that holistic support within the school setting will help them. Some will still need to then go on and access services, and that's what we're monitoring and looking at closely. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So Councillor Marshall-Catton next, please.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the contributions. What I would like to ask regarding the mental health of students and in relation to physical activities and creative ideas that we intend to introduce to schools. Obviously, with the lockdown, a lot of sports, inter-house competitions, inter-school competitions, all of that came to a standstill. And we do know with young children, that is a very, very big part of their everyday living that helps them physically and mentally. So what are the plans for the future? I've heard some of the things over the summer, because I know outside of learning, that will play a very, very big role in their mental and health well-being. So are there any plans, you know, over the summer holidays, as well as when they plan to return, in terms of bringing physical learning, in terms of PE, and all the competitions that children used to have over the, you know, all the months that they have lost, to bring it back and give them some sense of participating and getting engaged with one another again? I would just like to know if that's part of the plan, please.
Okay, who's best to pick that one up, please?
Dave's on the call, I think, to pick that up in terms of schools. I mean, I would echo the sentiment expressed there, because I do think physical activity will have a major impact, but you know, not just on physical health, but emotional well-being as well. So there does need to be a strong focus on it. But Dave can pick it up specifically from the school's point of view.
Yeah, I think from a school point of view, Councillor Marshall, there's a sense when we're talking with schools that actually working alongside, working within the guidance, they will be bringing things back as rapidly as they can, because I think school leaders know exactly the benefit that you're talking about in terms of bringing all those normal things back for young people to take part in. So I think working alongside the guidance, you know, and the physical activity will be able to restart again, and I think that schools will be putting things in place to do that. It may well be, and we're still waiting for further information about the summer schools, but that's there's opportunities there in terms of all those companies that probably haven't been able to do things during summer periods last year, that actually they'll be able to young people will start to be able to re-engage with all those activities. So I think that's one of the things that we'd like to see is more and more of those activities taking place again.
Okay, thank you for that, Dave. If I can move on to Celia's question next, please.
Thank you, Chair. Interested in the reference to rituals, and particularly I've got a concern with the pupils who've left primary schools, gone to high school, and not managed to establish friendship groups or a sort of identity of the new high school. And this is something I've come across with a couple of families who I'm friends with, where those pupils who would have been the transition year, and quite often they soon get established, but they've not had that chance, and they seem to have extended anxiety. Have you come across that and made any provision, particularly in preparation for that?
Jane, is that one you would pick up?
Did you want? So it's Karen Jessup. Did you want me just to answer?
I don't either. I don't mind.
It's just that's part of the wellbeing for education workers around transition and the year 6 year 7. There's some thematics that have come out of it, and so following the online and training that's been in place, there's also some opportunity for schools to think about how they can do some of that work with those particular populations prior to any additional needs being recognised. Sorry, Jane.
Shall I just jump in there as well?
Dave, if I really want to focus on the contributors we've got in the sector. So Jane, did you want to chip in on this?
I just wanted to recognise the concern, because I did flag that. I mean, that came directly from the Children Families Trust Board takeover, and young people were talking about that loss of kind of markers and rituals at the end of primary school, moving into secondary school, or finishing secondary school and going on to college, and that kind of loss. So not only did they talk about stress and anxiety relating to unknown, how the exams would be going forward, but also that loss of the normal celebration and marker of significant periods in their lives. So yes, so I just wanted to kind of feedback. Absolutely, we were hearing that and taking away actions as a partnership in terms of that.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, I've got a couple of last quick questions, and then if any of you've got any final thoughts again before we move on to look at the youth service. So Councillor Forsyth and then Kate, please.
Right, thank you very much. Mine's quite a specific question. Schools already have some pupils who are carers for their older, for their parents. Has consideration been made that cohort could well grow? There may be pupils coming back into school who have got caring responsibilities may not have had before, for a variety of reasons, including long COVID, of course.
I can probably answer a little bit around that. So we have the Young Carers Service in Leeds, which is newly commissioned, and the service delivery manager, Vicky Gabriel, who is responsible for family support, is leading on that. So there's very much an acknowledgement of that, and they are working in a really smart way. So I think previously the Young Carers Service that we were using would work with families for a very, very long time, and their plan is to work much smarter, so to limit that, and to also support clusters and other people who might be the most, because it's about the most appropriate person to support that child or young person. And sometimes it's a service that comes from elsewhere, sometimes it's within the existing network, but we're very much aware of that, and that is being addressed through the Young Carers Service.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. So Kate, you get the last question on this section.
Sorry, thank you. Just one quick point before I ask my question was just on the transitions.
If it could be really quick, Kate, because we're running over time. So you've got 30 seconds tops for your point and your
It was
question.
just to say I completely agree on that point, and I think I've mentioned it before that I think it'd be great if we could learn some lessons from the children that have missed out on those transitions and rituals and think about our next cohort and how we can best support them. My question was about infants, little ones that maybe haven't already been in a preschool or nursery setting, and I know that we don't have the data yet completely on the impact of them in terms of their socialisation and development, but what support can we give to those early years settings, including private settings, who might be getting children who perhaps have sort of difficulties in presentations that they've maybe not seen before because of the lack of socialisation, etc.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Jane.
Quickly, and then Janice might want to, the thing that sprang to my mind was the Universal Health Visiting Service that would identify and pick that up, but also supported by our very fantastic infant mental health service that's the expert resource in terms of attachment bonding and kind of early development relationships, etc., that will be able to support the universal settings in terms of how to respond, and if necessary would take referrals. So that's the expert resource that kind of wraps around.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Janice?
Yeah, just similar to Jane, really, I would say that is where the bulk of the support lies. And I think that health visiting services have introduced this early observation attachment screen as part of their universal offer. So they will be observing families interacting with their children, and where they don't see that there's the attachment and bonding and the warm, responsive relationships that we would want children to have as a beginning to set them off, then that we will be having additional support being offered to the family. That includes sessions within our children's centres. And given that I've got a minute to say something, I do just really want to push this idea of just how important it is that even though we're coming through austerity, we really do keep our focus on sort of those early years. We get our best sort of returns from our spending in that, but particularly our children's centres, because they have such fantastic relationships with local communities, and they give us our arena, our space where we can bring families together to do the sort of really important work, like support them around attachment and bonding. But yeah, just like Jane as well, Infant Mental Health Services just expanded its remit. It was looking at an offer from 0 to 2, and more recently there's been additional investment in it so as that we can provide that more specialist service to families with children from 2 to school age as well. So that's coming into place.
Great stuff. Thank you so much for all your contributions on that section. Really appreciate it. Again, it feels like a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but this is really helpful to us as we look for areas that we need to dig much deeper into going forwards. So we're moving on now to look at the youth service and how that service has seen the impact and ideas going forward. So Vicky, you have the floor entirely to yourself. So if you could just introduce yourself and give us your brief introduction. Again, the similar two questions: what do you see as the potential long-term impacts of COVID-19 on children and young people? And what would you see as the mitigating factors? So if you give us a brief introduction, and then we'll go into questions. I know Councillor Brent will be itching to get in with her question.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name's Vicky Fuggles. I'm the Youth Offer Lead, which oversees the youth service. So we've heard a lot, and so I don't want to repeat what we've already heard about some of the potential impact, and obviously you've read the report. So I think a couple of potential long-term impacts from a youth service perspective is really youth work is about bringing groups of young people together. It's about helping them come together, work together. It's youth-led in terms of what they want to do. It's helping them have new experiences within their peer groups and kind of challenging them in that safe environment. And so therefore, throughout the pandemic, we haven't really been able to do that in the usual way. So the youth work teams have continued to engage with young people, predominantly on the streets, just doing street-based youth work, and that hasn't been young person led, because we've been giving, you know, we've not been able to spend that sort of quality time. It's been more about just giving, you know, reinforcing public health messages and encouraging them to go home. Some of our work has continued, and Youth Matters is an example, and some of our other targeted youth work programmes have continued online via Zoom and different platforms like that. But what young people are telling us that they're pretty, you know, fed up with that. That's not the same as that face-to-face contact. So I think in terms of the longer term impact, we've missed quite a long period of time around where young people haven't had those diverse range of opportunities to develop their social skills, their, you know, getting along with people, team building, and also reduction in kind of that impacts on their physical health as well as their mental health. And I think the other sort of particular impact that we've seen is really that obviously a lot of young people, as we all have now very different routines, if we call it a routine at all. So as we move young people back into school, into college, into apprenticeships, then if they've been out of those routines for a long time, then that might be a difficulty, that might present some issues for some of those young people to get back into that routine, to be able to kind of really contribute and re-engage with whatever learning or work that they're wanting to aspire to. So in terms of our priorities really over the coming months, is to really, you know, reopen when it's safe and appropriate to do so, reopen more and more of our youth clubs, get back into those centres, because that's what young people want, that's what the youth workers want, and that's where we know that our best youth work can take place, that'll have most impact. So, you know, we will do that slowly and safely, but we will sort of aim to do that as the coming months, to re-engage those young people, to hear what they want to do, what youth work programmes they want, and we'll build on from that. I think in the report I've also referred to the use of our outdoor education centres, and I've heard a lot this morning around the benefits of kind of open space and opportunities to just get out of your house and get out of your normal environment. So throughout the pandemic, we have been using the Herd Farm and Westlands Activity Centre to take either individual or small groups and families over there that are particularly vulnerable, to offer them an opportunity to get out into the open air and into the countryside. So as we move forward as well, and we're really pleased, we're already getting quite a lot of inquiries from schools. So that was mentioned around, you know, outdoor education within a formal learning context. We're already having those discussions with the schools and through clusters, and that, you know, we'll start opening that opportunity up to many more young people and children as we go through the next few months. I think in terms of young people re-engaging with school, settling back in, what we obviously within the youth service, we also have our pathway support team. So they predominantly work with our 16 and 17-year-olds that are NEET. So their work has continued throughout with the support of some of the youth service staff as well, to re-engage, make contact with those young people. But I think moving forwards, we're now looking at those current year 11s that are in school, that we are, and the schools are starting to feel that perhaps they might not, you know, make a successful transition. So we're working already closely with our third sector partners as well, and I think we will be, as soon as schools are sort of getting back into the swing of things, we will be really asking them around which of the pupils they're most concerned about, so that we can get in there and start supporting those young people and their families now, so that we've got a number of months to help and support them, get them back on track, help them identify what they want to do come next September, so that they're in a good place to achieve that as well. And I think within that, we've also seen an increase in number of families choosing to elective home educate. So that's a group of children that we're really keen, so particularly those year 11s as well, that we need to make sure that we are in contact with them now to offer that support and help them make that smooth transition. I'll leave it there because I think there might be some questions, if that's okay.
I'm sure there will be, Vicky, but thank you very much. That was really, really helpful. So I'll go to Councillor Renshaw first, if you want to give us your question again, Karen.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask about the Youth Matters groups that meets up in my ward, but for the Outer South. And just before the latest lockdown, they were meeting up in small groups according to the size of the building. And those people are going to require extremely strong and supportive guidance from the youth service. And I just wondered what plans were in place. Schools are going back. Could you give us a date when those groups are going to be able to meet up again, as they are in their own bubble of Youth Matters groups? So I just wondered if you could be helpful on that. And you've just mentioned Herd Farm, but I just wondered if you could provide us with some figures as to how many children from within Leeds have been to Herd Farm, because I don't know of any in the Outer South who have been there in my area of the city, because obviously it's at the other side. But I think those figures would be helpful, because then it would give us some guidance as to where our children are regarding the service that you're providing. Thank you.
So if I just respond to the first point about the centre-based provision. So you are right, correct. So under the current guidance, we are able to provide targeted closed youth work groups to young people that need it. We're not allowed at the moment, it's not within the MYA guidance, to kind of open up and hold open access youth work provision. So as that changes, so we need to follow that guidance really. We're already working with colleagues in the communities and city development to make sure that we've already given a list of the centres that we want to use and when we want to use them. So we're working through that list with them. So that we can we're ready to, everything is in place in terms of the risk assessments and health and safety requirements. So as soon as we can, we can get back into those groups. As I said, in the meantime, a lot of groups are still happening, but they're happening online. But we would expect, after the Easter holidays, that there will be more and more opportunities for young people. I think one of the challenges is particularly, even though we can deliver closed groups to young people in the community and in buildings, as you're fully aware, some of our tradition, our youth work provision will normally engage with 50, 60 young people on a night. And so if those young people in that community say, a small group that have been particularly invited for a particular reason, and they see them going into the building, then potentially they will all come as well, even though they haven't been invited. And it's balancing that kind of relationship with them. We don't want to disappoint them. But we'll have and we will keep very sort of communication, so the local members know exactly what's happening, what the plan is at the same time. Yeah.
can I just come back there, Chair? Because we did have
Sorry, I'm sorry. On this occasion, you can't, Councillor Renshaw, because we're running
well,
out of time.
I'll email
and I've got more
Vicky.
questions. Yes, please. Thank you. So we've got two more quick questions before we need to move on. So we've got Councillor Illingworth and then Councillor Lennox, please.
Yes, this question spreads outside this area, but it's a good time to ask it. It's about the school day. I mean, it's obvious that there's more activities planned and it won't all fit into a conventional school day for a whole kind of reasons. Obviously, there's a need to protect teachers' working hours and not expect them to be superhuman, but many remedial activities are going to take place outside school. Small group work will need more space as well as more time. And it seems to me that it's inevitably points the direction of longer school days and more time out, more gaps. And that has knock-on effect on caretakers, security, governance, safeguarding, heating and lighting, food. So what are you going to do about hours? And obviously it's very relevant to youth work, but I think it spreads wider than that. And how are we going to operate a system which is a bit more flexible, I suspect, than we've had in the past?
Okay, I think perhaps Vicky can answer bits of that, and it might be something for Dave and Councillor Pryor to pick up in summing up a bit later on the other points. So
I'd like
Vicky,
that,
and
yeah.
yeah, no problem. So Vicky.
So youth work takes place outside of school hours and is delivered by youth workers as opposed to teaching staff. As I just said about the buildings, you're absolutely right in terms of expectations around not sharing buildings, but having multiple users, and that, so it does need to be carefully planned. I suppose in terms of overloading or too much, I think that it's really important as we move forward that young people have a choice and a variety of activity that they can dip in and out of. So our youth work will be taking place sort of evenings, weekends, and obviously in school holidays, and so they can pick and choose really, and there will be lots of different things at different times, so that something for everybody, but certainly not overloading young people, I think. Does that answer some of that?
Yeah, thank you for that. So final quick question from Councillor Lennox, and then we'll be moving on to the next section.
Thank you. Thanks for everything that's been discussed today. I'm just wondering whether the youth service in your planning or in the work that you've been doing over the course of the year have been linking in with antisocial behaviour teams and the police and the neighbourhood policing network. There was quite a severe incident in my ward at the weekend, which was related to a group of youths. Now, we don't know whether these youths would normally be youths who do engage with our fantastic youth service that we do have in our ward, but I'm wondering whether there's been any intelligence about whether there's an increase in issues. I know that people's perception may be that there has been, but that's, I think, because everyone's at home a lot. And I'm just wondering if there's any work or intelligence happening around that. Because, as I say, we have absolutely outstanding youth provision in my ward and in the Outer East, but I feel like it'd be interesting, especially with everything that we've mentioned about mental health of young people, to sort of gauge whether antisocial behaviour and policing teams have any input to give on the work and the research that's been happening.
Okay, thank you. I suppose the answer is yes. Throughout the pandemic, the youth service in the locality teams have been working on a daily basis with first the police and LASBAT as well, and particularly in the different sort of periods of lockdown, we've had a sort of a daily two-way communication. So police have been in local policing teams have been letting the local youth work teams know where they've seen or heard, or had reports of groups of young people, perhaps, engaging in antisocial behaviour. And that's meant that the teams could plan their routes and the areas that they were prioritising to go, to obviously to engage with those young people, and sort of obviously offer them some other alternative, sort of encourage them to go home, disperse. And that's worked really well because obviously, as well as us being able to engage with those young people, it's stopped the need for a police intervention. And as we know, you know, if there's a group of young people and the police go, then it's much more likely, and that's not, you know, it's not a criticism of police, but that will probably escalate the situation rather than de-escalate. So that's worked really well, and all the youth work teams, regular members of both the LASBAT teams and the tasking, and so that communication is really happening. Obviously, we work alongside our youth justice colleagues, so where we're seeing young people so perhaps on the periphery of moving from antisocial to offending type behaviour, then we can quickly refer them into the youth justice. And there's also been a significant amount of money brought into the city through the violence reduction unit, and that's engaging the youth service as well as some of our third sector partners have been successful in receiving that money. And so we've been able to deliver some targeted youth work programmes specifically around to prevent serious youth violence. For your second part of the question around, you know, has it been an increase? I think it is fair to say that in this third lockdown that we're in now, that there has been. Throughout the pandemic, we've seen kind of pockets in the city, sort of incidents of ASB involving young people sort of go up and down, and it's not always been in the areas that we potentially would expect, or, you know, maybe it has been just all over the city. But I think it is fair to say, you know, it's a year nearly now, so young people are getting really bored and fed up and trying to, you know, find ways to keep themselves busy, and that's not always such a good thing. So I think it is fair. So, you know, as we've said, we're continuing to work, we'll continue to engage with those and make sure that those young people, now when schools are out, that we're getting them back into school actually, and hopefully that will get them, will help protect them from being at risk of anything else.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Thank you for your contribution this morning, and thank you to you and your team for all the work that you're doing as well. It really is appreciated across the board. I'm sure lots of positive comments coming in from members on the call. Okay, so we're going to move on now. It's always a particular pleasure to welcome Richard Cracknell to our meetings. It's a little while since he's been with us, and we also have some members of the Youth Council with us. So we're really, really delighted to have you with us this morning. So I'm going to ask Richard just to take over for a few minutes and introduce the guests that have joined us. Just by way of reminder for everyone, the two questions that we're really keen to hear your views on are what you regard as the potential long-term impacts of COVID-19 on young people in Leeds from your perspective, and what are the priority actions that you would have to try and mitigate those things. So we'll have 5 or 10 minutes with Richard and all of our guests just to introduce themselves and give us their initial thoughts, and then we'll go into question and answers from there. So Richard, really good to have you with us, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Cracknell. I'm a Voice, Influence and Change Coordinator in the Children and Families Directorate. As Councillor Lamb said, I'm really fortunate this morning and grateful to be joined by 5 members of our Leeds Youth Council Working Group. And I'm just going to take a minute now to ask them all to introduce themselves. So I'll be asking for their name, school, and if you can share your age, please. And can we start with Charlotte, who's the chair of the Youth Council Working Group? Charlotte.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Williams. I'm 18 next week, and I go to Benton Park High School, or sixth form.
Thank you, Charlotte. Atia, would you like to go next, please?
Hi, my name is Atia. I am 13 years old and I go to the Ruth Voss Academy.
Thank you, Atia. And Amelie?
Hi everyone, my name is Amelie. I am 15 and I go to Horsforth School.
Great, thanks, Amelie. And Alana?
Hi, my name is Alana. I'm 17 and I go to Leeds City College.
That's great. And finally, we've got Kira, who has been having connection issues, but we'll give her a try. Kira, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, Hi, I'm 17 and I go to Notre Dame.
Thanks, everybody. So as Councillor Lamb said, we're going to get into the questions about the long-term impacts of the pandemic. But before we do, we thought it'd be useful just to take a minute, just to give the board a flavour of the kind of work the Youth Council's been doing over the last year. I will just say, like everything else, we've had to be very adaptable. I do like to thank the young people for their flexibility and resilience, and we've moved all of our work online. So we're very familiar with these type of Zoom calls at the moment. And I'm going to introduce Charlotte just to give some examples of some of the projects that the group's been involved with. So over to you, Charlotte.
Yes, we've managed to do like almost an impressive amount, I would say, being on Zoom calls and everything. So we've had a bunch of Q&As with like Saltariq, Fiona, Verner and her cat, and Hilary Ben. We have been doing the Youth COVID Bronze Group, which then I believe report back to the group of teachers about the COVID situation. We've had multiple consultations with the House of Lords, consultations with Ofqual and the Department for Education about the 2021 exams. We took over the Children's Trust Board. We've done a bunch of fun little lockdown projects for children in Leeds and for Child Friendly Leeds, including the LYC Lockdown Challenge in April. And we have just started a new mental health campaign, which we're kind of working on now, as well as we managed to do quite a bit with the campaign we were running last year about the environment and climate change, which is kind of a very aggressive rundown.
That's perfect. Thank you, Charlotte. And just to briefly say, the Youth Voice COVID Bronze Group that Charlotte mentioned, we've been doing that in partnership with School Improvement and Erica, who's on this call, and that's been a really valuable route to enable students to feedback to our colleagues in schools about what's working well for them in terms of remote learning and what needs improving. So thank you very much for Charlotte. That's really helpful. What I'm going to do now, I'm just going to open up to the five of you that initial talking point question that Councillor Lamb proposed, which is what you think will be the long-term impacts of the pandemic on young people in our city. And we've heard lots of different perspectives from contributors throughout the meeting. So it'll be really interesting. And what we're looking for, I think, is your personal take on it, of you and perhaps your friendship circles. Give us a bit of a flavour and insight into what young people like you are thinking. So I might start off with Alana, if that's okay. So Alana, what do you personally think will be the long-term impacts of the pandemic on young people here in Leeds?
I believe from a perspective of a year 11 who left high school during the pandemic, which meant that we missed out on like our last 3 months of high school. I think that one of the impacts is the lack of closure that we got, because we didn't have any of the usual events like graduation, prom. We didn't even really get a leavers day. So having to leave high school without that closure, without that real goodbye, is definitely something that I've struggled with, and I know a lot of my friends have as well. So I definitely think that that's going to be a long-term impact, because it's just difficult to move on to a new chapter of your life when you haven't really said goodbye and got closure on the last chapter. So that's definitely something that I'd say definitely impacts me and a lot of other people in my position.
Thanks, Alana. It's really useful to get perspectives of different year groups. And actually, what you referenced was raised earlier in the meeting by a colleague about some of these rituals and rites of passage that are so important to growing up that a lot of you have missed out on. And we will give you an opportunity to suggest to the board some things you think might mitigate that or help you in the future with that. So thank you very much for that, Alana. We'll move to one of our younger members now and get a different age perspective. So Atia, if it's okay, the same question for you. What do you think will be some of the long-term impacts on maybe students in your year group here in the city?
Well, me being a 13-year-old, I would personally say that the biggest thing that would be like a long-term impact would be the issue of lost learning, because obviously when we were online, it was a struggle to adapt from like being face-to-face to online. So the issue of like lost learning, and a big one would be mental health on everyone. So like how it's impacted students with how they have managed to get like used to the new technology and all the new services that they may not have been using previously.
Thank you, Atia. That's very helpful. Next, can we hear from Kira, please?
I think one of the only positives from the pandemic would be how remote learning has allowed for lessons to be recorded so that you can go back to them later. So if that were something that was to be continued, I think a lot of students would welcome that because it's been very helpful. But on a more negative note, I think there's been a lot of severe mental health impacts on young people that will probably see the pandemic has just sort of acted as a catalyst to expose the problems that young people are facing. And I think the pandemic over, the focus on health, it shouldn't be shifted away from that, because a lot of young people are struggling.
Thanks, Kira. Your connection isn't the greatest internet connection, so we hope that stabilizes a bit. And thanks also for referencing a positive. So I do have to say, in a lot of the discussions, although the focus has been on the negative impacts, quite a few young people we're working with have, just like Kira just said, expressed some positives and things that actually we've been forced to do as a result of the pandemic that actually work really well for our students in the city. And as Kira said, and she's not the only person, some of the remote learning offers that schools have provided will work really well going forward in terms of revision and exam support. So thanks for making sure there's a positive as well, Kira. Amelie, can we come to you next, please?
Yeah, hi. What I think one of the long-term impacts of the pandemic is the experiences we gain as young people. So, for example, I'm in year 10, which is the year I should have done my work experience. I should have done DOV. So these things have been cancelled, which I guess you could class as extracurricular activities. So it's all about our social lives on the outside and what we're missing out on as teenagers.
Thanks, Emily. It's good to see a lot of these key points getting covered individually. We're going to come over to you next, Charlotte, please.
I think, kind of following on from what everyone said, I think mental health is really something that's not only been uncovered slightly more within this pandemic, but it's going to be something that continues to be a real key point, especially as people come out of it and learn to readjust. As a year 13, I know there's been so much uncertainty, especially around our exams, because last year we were year 12s, and so we were kind of skipped over when they were focusing on the year 11s and 13s last year. But I also there have been positives. So personally, as the pandemic has uncovered some possible issues for me, I find the uploading of the PowerPoints onto like Teams and stuff to be incredibly useful for me to kind of go back when I wasn't able to concentrate in the lesson. I think my school especially, has been absolutely fantastic with their support of young people throughout this situation. And I do think that it's really shown kind of a level of kindness in everybody, but also just the extent to which a lot of people's schools are willing to go for their students. And I do think that's been really positive.
Thank you, Charlotte. And your thoughts have been echoed in a lot of our meetings with young people who have spoke very glowingly about what their schools have provided for them. And I know, Charlotte, at the recent Children and Families Trust Board takeover, you spoke about the positive impact one of your teachers has had on your own well-being and your life through going out of their way to create a space for you to talk and share your feelings. And was it one of your physics teachers, if I remember rightly?
Teacher, absolute legend.
So we'll have that noted, that Charlotte's physics teacher is, and I quote, an absolute legend. Just on the subject of exams, we talked about the Youth Voice COVID Bronze Group, and it was referenced earlier in the meeting, but all of the uncertainty around exams and assessments that you had to go through until, I think, a fortnight ago. Just out of interest, would one of you like to speak about how you feel now you do have some certainty around exams and assessment? Charlotte, your hand flew straight up then. Would you like to pick that up?
I'd like to very quickly say, I don't believe there is currently certainty around the exam situation. But I think because it's kind of the government has gone, it's not our problem anymore, it's the teacher's problem. And so now, instead of there being like countrywide confusion, Now it's just, I don't know how my particular teachers are going to assess me. I don't know if we're going to continue to finish the course, and if we don't, how that's going to impact my university. I'm not sure kind of if we're going to do mini exams or if they're going to make me do like full exams like I would at the end of the year. I think now it's just kind of uncertainty on a lower level, and I do personally think that I wouldn't be this stressed had I had a comprehensive education up until like through the last year and a half of my A levels. Like, I understand there's a normal level of exam stress when you get to about this point, but I do believe it would be significantly lower without COVID.
Thanks, Charlotte. Maybe rather than certainty, I should have said less uncertainty. And you're totally right, in conjunction with the lost learning you've had, it's really problematic. And I think work we can do in the future is looking how we can reassure students like yourself and communicate better of what is actually happening once we have certainty as well. Kira, I can see your hands up. I'm just going to move on. Hopefully you can pick it up, because I do want to come to the second sort of talking point that Councillor Lamb proposed, which is we're really interested to find out the kind of things you think your schools, the City Council and our partners can do to alleviate and counteract some of the impacts that you've already talked about. Practical things that perhaps we can put into place over the coming months ahead. Has anyone got an idea you'd like to share? And because I can't see everyone's screens, if you just want to talk, although Amelie, I can see your hand up, so we might start with you.
Yeah, so what we've been doing as a Leeds Youth Council is we've been having some meetings about mental health support. And so I think going forward, mental health groups would be a really successful sort of communal thing to go forwards with. I think if it's with your peers, with other young people, it's a safe space which everyone can talk about it, and it would really support us.
Thanks, Emily. Would anyone like to add to Amelie's comments around mental health?
Yes, as Emily has said, we would prefer more mental health support, because it's just basically one of the long-term thing that students are going through at this moment. So it would be helpful if schools thought of ways on how they could support us within that. And also, I think that schools could like try to help us with some type of lost learning, because obviously everyone has their way of processing and learning stuff. So it's just, it would be like, it would seem helpful if there was something done with lost learning, so that not everyone is lost or feel out of place.
Thank you, Atia. Alana, Kira, have you got anything you'd like to add in terms of what we can do to help counteract some of the problems you've faced? Alana, you talked about missing your sort of prom and your rite of passage when you left Coburn. I mean, none of us, unfortunately, have got time machines. We haven't got DeLoreans. But can you think of anything that your college or the council or our youth services could do to help fill that void?
I think just maybe encouraging schools to like, I understand, like you said, we don't have a time machine and stuff, but maybe if they do have the facilities, maybe our high schools could try and sort out a day for us to maybe come back, because I know this isn't the case for all high schools, but we didn't actually have a results day either. So the last time I ever went in my high school was the last day, so almost a year ago. So maybe just being able to encourage high schools to do some kind of leavers day. I know that we left over a year ago, but I also know that a lot of people in my year group would be more than happy to go back and just see everyone one last time. And I just think that being able to have that experience would just be something that would really help us all be able to move on after that.
Thanks, Alana. That's a really good suggestion. I'd like to add as well, for a lot of your teaching staff as well, who went through that whole journey with you over the years, they didn't get that opportunity to say goodbye. So it might be something that colleagues in school are up for, and just making the most of this modern technology. Perhaps they could organise something where you can just say goodbye online in a similar setting. Kira, Amelie, have you got anything you'd like to add in terms of what we can do to help with some of these issues? Kira.
I think one issue that the pandemic has kind of shown is the amount of people who don't have access to the internet or a laptop. And I think that the pandemic showing that up. Even in normal times, in this day and age, it's really, really important that people have access to the internet and so work, because
your connection's dropped. Sorry. Your connection's dropped out, Kira. But on the subject of access to information technology, I know the Scrutiny Board at their last meeting spent quite a lot of time looking at the issue of IT provision. If you can go back and watch that meeting on YouTube. We're going to start wrapping up the questions now, just to give the board the opportunity to ask their own questions. Before we do, and why you've got this audience, and this goes out to our 5 youth councillors who have joined today, is there anything else you'd like to add on a personal level from you and your friends, a message that you would like communicating to the City Council and our partners? This is a good opportunity for you to do just that. So I'll hand it over to you. And feel free just to speak. If not, we'll move to questions from the board, if that's okay, Chair. We'll just give a minute for anyone to raise anything.
What I think would be really good is if we could organise some sort of work experience, because I know for a fact that many children across Leeds will have missed out on that, which doesn't seem as good to employers coming in the future. So some sort of work experience, if that could be organised, that could be really successful.
Thanks, Emily. That's a very helpful suggestion. And one thing we haven't covered, because we're focusing your experience of students, but the longer term effects of the pandemic in terms of the economy might have a disproportionate effect on 18 to 24-year-olds. So as you get older and enter the workplace and you go off perhaps to study at university or to go and get a job and start your careers, things like missing out on this opportunity to accrue work experience might count against you. So that's a really useful point to raise to the Scrutiny Board. So thank you for that, Emily. If no one else has got something they'd like to add, Councillor Lamb, I might hand over to you to field questions to the young people, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Richard. Thank you all so much. That's been a really fascinating session, and many happy returns to Charlotte for next week on behalf of the board. Big birthday for you. So who has got questions? We've got a bit of time, so we'll start with Kate, please.
Thank you. Emily, I was interested in what you were saying about the mental health support groups. I think that's an absolutely fantastic idea. And I just was wondering what you thought about how that could best be organised. Do you think that that would be something that will be better face-to-face in school, and would that be in peers in your own year groups or across different age groups? What might be sort of the barriers to that, and what might be factors that might encourage people to attend?
I think it would be a lot better face-to-face, as I know teenagers are already facing too much screen time. So I think online you wouldn't have as many people attending, whereas if it was face-to-face, I think more people would come. But what you said about the different age groups is maybe we could do key stage 3s, key stage 4s, and then key stage 5s. So it's got a bit of mixed ages, but all around one base point. But I think, like you said, definitely face-to-face instead of online.
So do you think that schools, it would be best if schools, so familiar staff, would facilitate that and organise that within school as opposed to it being in a different setting?
Yeah, definitely in school. It's much more easier to access, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that.
Sorry, Chair, can I just pick up, because Alana's on the call, and Alana is on our Youth Council campaign group. Alana, would you feel comfortable just really quickly, maybe 30, 60 seconds, because we're talking about mental health peer support, share with the board the project you've just started alongside our colleagues in public health at the council, if that's okay?
Yeah, so our campaign for this year as Leeds Youth Councillors is to try and encourage schools to have mental health support in the format of clubs. So basically we're thinking of doing like a resource pack that will be available for schools, and this will encourage them to like have more mental health support available for students. And we've been talking about how we can raise awareness of mental health in schools, how we can encourage students, like it was said earlier, how we can encourage students to speak up about their mental health and feel comfortable attending these clubs. So this is something that we're going to be working on over the next few weeks, just to make sure that when we do return to school, that there is a lot of mental health support available for students.
That's perfect. Thanks, Alana. And just to add, that will be for youth groups, youth and community groups in the city as well. And the focus is on it being peer-led, which Amelie mentioned. Thank you, Chair. Sorry.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. Celia is next, please.
Thank you. Just generally to any and all of you, and thank you. It's been interesting listening to what you've had to say. We've talked a lot this morning about provision other than subject-based, other than your academic lessons, and what's needed. I mean, there's been suggestions about summer schools where there are different activities, creative activities, sporting activities. What are your views on that? How much do you think that would be helpful, interesting? Would you all be interested in doing things like that, be it after school? And I don't mean with the teachers, but with other people and in the holidays.
Can I comment on that? Well, for me, I'd say that is a great idea, and personally I would love to attend something like that, because during school, when school was open and everything, I used to do a lot of football after school, and I just say personally, me and my friends, we've lost on a lot of our physical stuff that we used to do, and it's just now everything is in front of our screens and we don't really feel that much of motivation to do anything. So it'd just be like a great time to get teenagers away from their screens and maybe to do something that they're passionate about, rather than just like sitting in front of their screens and just learning, which really doesn't provide much help with their physical life.
Can I just comment?
Sorry.
Of course you can.
I know my mum works in an SEN school in Bradford, and we've had a couple of conversations about this. But I know that a lot of the people who would really benefit from this kind of thing are the students who struggle to engage in online learning. But I also don't necessarily think that you would be able to get them to engage in this, as it's something so structured. And I also personally, I mean, I know I'm kind of not who it's targeted at, as I am aging out of secondary school at this point. But the idea of doing more school after this kind of year in which, because school has been at home, everything has felt like school, makes my brain hurt a little bit.
Thank you, Charlotte. Did anyone else want to answer that?
Please, can I add something onto that?
Of course.
What I'm thinking is, if it was throughout the summer, I don't think as many people would attend. Whereas if it was maybe a few hours after school, once or twice a week, a lot more people would be interested, because I don't think, like Charlotte said, everything has felt like school at the moment. And so giving up summer to then focus on not school, but more school-based activities wouldn't be that successful. However, after school, just in the day, maybe once or twice a week, that would be a lot more helpful and more people would attend, I think.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, so if we could move on next to Councillor Marshall Catung, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to say a very huge thank you to all the teenagers who have come here to speak to us. Very brave, and you've all been very articulate. I wish I was like you all when I was your age, but you're in one of the best ages right now. I know the pandemic has been very, very difficult for all of you, and that's why we're here to make sure we hold your hands and see you through. Specifically to Alana and what you were saying about not having the closure with your prom for year 11 and year 13, I empathize with that because my teenagers were planning the suits they were going to wear from year 10, and that never happened. So I do know that it can be very painful, but if you still think and feel you would want that closure and how you would like us to help, you also have to remember that you were 16 at the time you would have had your prom. And by the time everywhere opens up, and if your school or parents decide or the community decide to arrange something for you, some of you would have been 18. And at 18, most of you know how to organize your stuff yourself. So my question to you now is, if we intervene in terms of trying to help organize a closure for all of you who were in year 11 and year 13 with your schools, is it something you'll want the schools to organize, you to organize, or your parents to organize?
I completely understand about the fact that when we're 18, we can definitely organise something ourselves. I think that a lot of people might not know how to reach out to a lot of people, and I know I personally would feel a bit nervous reaching out to some of the people that I didn't really know too well in high school, but I also wouldn't want to leave anyone out. Whereas if schools did reach out to us, obviously schools don't have to have like the full control over what we do, so they don't have to plan everything, but maybe if they reached out and said, we'd like you all to have like this meet up goodbye thing, I definitely think that a lot of people would take them up on the offer, regardless of our age, because I do think that a lot of people feel the same as me in terms of the fact that we just would like something to say goodbye and to celebrate 5 years of our lives. But I do think that if schools did that, I think that a lot more people would be encouraged to take part.
Okay, thank you.
And did any of the others want to come in on that point?
I think that by the time I leave high school, hopefully, there will be able to be some sort of kind of celebration of it. But I think, especially because I know for the year 11s who left last year, it's a bit different because, like in Alana's case, she's gone from being at a high school to being at a college that's completely separate. So that'd be quite difficult. Whereas I think for like the people leaving sixth form, it would probably be a lot more helpful if schools could just organise it because they still have all of us there, if that makes sense. Because I know at the end of year 13, our school takes us all to the pub up the road. And I think that's something that could very easily be kind of organised again, as opposed to a prom, which is a lot more effort.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. So the last question in this section is going to Councillor Forsyth.
I had put my hand down, but I realise that the concentration for you is on your experience as teenagers and being at secondary school. However, you have all been through primary school, and some of you may well have some younger siblings as well. Is there anything else that perhaps we could be considering for primary school children, or even younger than that, if that's not too much out of your remit? But thank you very much, all of you, as well, echoing everybody else has said. Thank you very much for coming along to our meeting today.
I just wanted to kind of comment on this because I was thinking, I think over the summer, I was thinking that I felt really, really bad for the children who had gone from year 6 to year 7, or who had started in year 7 this year, because I know that a lot of the things that made me feel comfortable coming into high school happened around kind of May, June of last year, with like multiple transition days and kind of evenings in which we got to enjoy it. And then coming into high school, we had like a disco in September, and it all made me feel a lot more comfortable. There's not much I can think that could help that, but I absolutely kind of see where you're coming from in that sense, because I think my high school experience would have started very differently had I not had all of the transition elements.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. And anybody else want to chip in on that one?
Well, like Charlotte has said, personally for me too, when I transitioned from primary to high, I had everyone around me to feel like, yes, I'm not alone on this journey, I've got them. And obviously for primary school children, it usually they are taught with like interactions, and obviously whilst we're online, none of that is happening. So possibly it's like when we do return to school or when face-to-face teaching does happen, I'd say that there's like a lot more in primary schools, a lot more interactive learning. So it just gets like children back into like the normal routine, hopefully, and that they don't feel like they have missed out something that they would like to have done.
Okay, thank you for that, and thank you for the sort of put into the chat as well. So, can I just check, either Richard or any of the young people, are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with us before we wrap up and move on to the next section of our meeting?
I'd just really quickly like to say, obviously a lot of negative things that could be improved on have been brought up, but as a young person, I'm also really grateful for all the support that I have received. I think that obviously this has been a really difficult time for us all and no one's really known how to deal with it. So in the ways that it has been dealt with, I feel like I'm really grateful that I feel like I've had a very good support system, even when I've been at home, especially during this lockdown when people knew a lot more about it. I feel like I've really benefited from the support that's been available. So I also want to say like that I'm very grateful as a young person for everything that's been available to me.
That's really positive. Thank you so much. Okay, and anybody else? Richard, any final thoughts from you?
The youth councillors today have done a really good job of distilling sort of 6-12 months worth of discussions with a lot wider groups of young people down into your call today. They've touched on all the main themes that we wanted to cover, from remote learning to lost learning, to exams, to rites of passage. And obviously all of this is so difficult because it's such a fast moving situation. We'll be talking about remote learning and then schools are going back. But I do think in the future, and the youth council said it today, some of the things we've been forced to implement as a result of the pandemic will still pay dividends going into the future in terms of how we provide education and other services in the city. And just interestingly, some youth councillors who have got involved over the last 6 months have said they only started taking part because we were doing things online and they wouldn't necessarily have the confidence to come to something in person. So there's lots of like interesting angles that we're not going to explore today. So thank you, Chair, and thanks again to Charlotte, Atia, Amelie, Alana and Kira for joining us this morning.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Richard. And well, one positive is I don't think we would have engaged with young people like this for our session if it wasn't for doing it through this platform. So it's been really positive for us. So if on behalf of the board, I can thank Charlotte, Alana, Amelie, Atia, Kira, Richard for facilitating. You have added a huge amount of value to our work this morning and given us an awful lot of food for thought. And really incredibly grateful to you to giving up your valuable time to come and join us today. You're very welcome to stay on for the rest of the session. You don't have to, so if you've got lessons and things to get back to, then feel free, but we'll be delighted if you want to stay and listen in. And you're welcome to chip in as well if you stay, if you have anything you want to say as we go along. But there's lots of messages flooding in, so thank you so much again. Okay, so we're going to move on now. We'll have a minute while everyone applauds. And if I can hand over to Sal and his team, just for 5 or 10 minutes, just to, it's slightly unusual the way we've done it this morning, is you've listened rather than talked, but it'd be useful now just to get your feedback on what you've heard, and really what we're moving towards is thinking from the Scrutiny Board's perspective about next steps and the sort of areas of work we might want to recommend to the successor board next year to dig deeper into and keep a watching brief on as we move forward. So if I hand over to Sal, and I'll also give an opportunity to Councillors Verner and Pryor to give us their feedback as well, and then the board can start to think about next steps and also what we might want to put into a statement at the end of the session. So Sal, over to you, please.
Thanks, Councillor. Can I just start by saying huge thanks to the Youth Council there. I have met with them a number of times through the pandemic, and each time their insight, thoughts and ideas are remarkable, really. And, you know, as a city, we have focused over the years on listening to the voice of children and acting, and I think, and acting on what they tell us. I think the listening part of it has just happened there and tells you why it's really important for us and why it's central to everything that we do. The responsibility part of it is that we go away and act on it. And you know, I was struck by a couple of things that I just want to very briefly reflect on, if that's okay. I mean, one is the rituals bit, and we will speak to schools through the opportunities that we have about that sort of idea that Alana talked about in terms of a Leavers Day or some sort of facilitated session at some point when it's safe to do so, of bringing those children and young people back together. You know, I've only been once, but you know, quite a lot of people grow up and have reunions every 10 or 20 years with their schools, and I've only ever been to one. And so it's not just about a ritual now, it's almost about what happens throughout your life. And so bringing them together just to have that sense of closure that they talked about, I think is really important. The other thing that I reflect on, part of this is to do with me being an old man now, but you know, we when I went through school in the 80s, we wouldn't have talked about mental health issues. You know, there would be no recognition from ourselves that we might be struggling with our mental health. So in many ways, the ability for those young people to articulate that so clearly and openly does show massive progression in lots of ways, but also what it shows is the significant amount of need in that area. And so I would really, you know, take. I don't think there was any of them that didn't mention it. And so I take some encouragement from that fact that children, young people feel comfortable about talking about it, pointing to it, but they're also expressing need. And I think that that's another point that I would really strongly take away from today's session. And then finally, I think something about communication, clarity around what's going to be happening with exams, assessment, and how schools are going to be dealing with it. So we will pick those issues up with them. There's half a dozen things that they suggested. I think we will follow every one of those up in any way that we can. So the only other thing I would kind of point to, I think, in terms of looking forward and thinking about is the experience around babies and toddlers. I was struck by that, some of that feedback that we got, you know, and you know, I genuinely don't mean to minimize this by saying this, but I went for a lockdown puppy, and his socialization with others like him has been severely limited, and there's something about parents, babies, seeing not just their family and friends but other social activities that we would all be used to not taking place in over this last year. And I think that there's an enormous amount of attention that we need to put to that. I think in the city we had challenges before coming into lockdown around how well children do in the early years, and so a renewed focus around that work, I think, given also the challenges that we've had in the sector, I think is really important. So I think, you know, I think the discussion today, I really appreciate the input from all of the Scrutiny Board members and from all of the people that you've had here today, particularly the young people. But it just shows you about the system-wide challenge that we've got, but also I think how well set up we are. I was struck just listening to the breadth of expertise and experience in the room to kind of say we've got the people and the breadth of expertise in the city to be able to respond to this and come out of this really strongly with creative and innovative approaches. So I'm encouraged by that, and I think for us as a system, it's about harnessing all of that moving forward on a positive front, given that some of the young people that have been most impacted by this and whom we are responsible for can come to this venue and present in the articulate way that they have, doubles our responsibility in terms of what we need to do moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Sal. If I can give Dave and Julie particularly an opportunity, I normally let people say what they want to say, but I cut you both off during the meeting, so I'm sorry for that, but I hope you understand why, and we needed to keep pace to it. So either Dave or Julie, whoever wants to go first.
There's so many things to reflect on there, but pretty much as what Sal said, it's about, there's been a huge amount of work done by schools and school leaders and teachers across the city, and they're already sort of thinking very carefully about all those plans in place to bring everything back into some normal, and the discussions we're having with school leaders yesterday, very much there's that excitement about, and a bit on the back of what Steve was saying earlier on, that actually just getting the kids back into school, getting them into normal routines, getting them into activities, being with their friends will actually be one of the most significant impacts for those young people. I think that on the back of what we've heard today, we need to continue with all those building back better conversations with young people, with stakeholders. That's really important to build on the partnerships with internal, external schools, children, and build on that going forward, and use our position to promote that change. 100% digital. Kira was talking about that, about the utilising the benefits of 100% digital, and that's probably a real drive for the local authority to support all the work around that, and using all the advantages that digital and remote learning can offer. Some work, I think, around us continue to work around stakeholders, particularly around the assessment for those 2-year groups that are currently, particularly year 10 and 12, that are sort of will come, they've missed their learning, plus they've got their assessments to come next year. Reading is a massive driver for the city in terms of, and I just, Kate mentioned about the transition. That's been a major impact, the transition, particularly from year 6 to 7 last year. Lots of schools doing some really good work actually around that, with online sort of virtual tours and all sorts of things. And just that's going to be a focus at our next bronze meeting, actually, to start talking about how do we do that transition from year 6 to year 7 this coming year as well, and how do we support those year 7s in terms of the experience that they've had, because I think they've suffered quite significantly. Lots of things that we can have conversations from what the young people have said in terms of encouraging those reunion days of how we get those young people back, and schools are working really hard on those loss of learning strategies and opportunities, and some great thoughts about the work experience. So there's an awful lot that we can pick up on and work alongside colleagues going forward.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Julie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Lamb. So we've just heard so much, haven't we? The discussion has been so rich. I think for me, as Sal said, as Dave said, that real focus on mental health, but mental health in relation to parents and carers, and in relation to children and young people. And for me, just the importance of that think, family, work, family approach, and that whole system approach. I think the impact on learning, obviously on educational outcomes, but also I think just in relation to children and young people's general development. We've heard here about opportunities to go and play football and to get out and about and have those physical opportunities. So for me, there's a real focus on general development as well as educational outcomes. The early years, absolutely. I became a grandma, a nana, just before lockdown, so really aware, of how parents have struggled as they've had babies, during lockdown, just before lockdown. So that real focus absolutely on early years, and we don't really know. I I think as Jane Mushenko and others have talked about today, we don't really know the long-lasting impact on our 0 to 5s, you know, and mothers who are expecting at the moment, babies who are yet to be born. So I think that will be a real area of focus for us. Adolescents, you know, so we've heard, you know, about routines, you know, adolescents who are probably, you know, struggling really to sort of engage anyway in education and positive activities, who may have had their routines disrupted, you know, thinking about transitions, education, training, employment, work experience. So real focus for me on adolescents. Absolutely continuing to hear the voices and experiences of children and young people across the city. You know, so again, that continued focus on voice and influence, but also on action. You know, having this conversation today, these discussions today, the discussions throughout the pandemic, we've got a list of actions that we will want to focus on. And I think finally, for me, I think a focus on the workforce. You know, because again, I'm just very conscious of our duty of care to children and young people and families and communities, but also the duty of care to our workforce and ensuring that we are supporting our people and our staff to be the best that they can be, so that they can, you know, really provide that support to children and young people.
Okay, thank you, Julie. I'm not quite sure how, but Councillor Brenshaw's managed to share her screen with everybody, so you might want to unshare it, Councillor Renshaw. But in the meantime, I'll bring Val in.
Thank you, Councillor. Just very quickly, because I know that we're pressed for time, and I think that both Julie and Sal have already said an awful lot of what I wanted just to pick up on. But I think the one thing for me, just hearing those young people's voices, absolutely brilliant, the way that they could be so articulate and speak to us about what they have identified. And a lot that came out there was about those immediate needs and immediate responses and the things that we are probably going to see as we come down out of lockdown, about the immediate impacts. But I think it's really important as well, which some people have referred to within this conversation, is about those longer term effects for some groups and some particular groups of young people who perhaps are not as articulate and perhaps have particular difficulties and particular needs as well, and hearing their voice within all of this picture. Because I think we're all very well aware of how the correlation between well-being and good mental health impacts upon learning. And I think we will see some of those effects you know, really impacting as we move into the future years as well for particular groups of children. I think we really need to be aware of that and ensure that this isn't just a response that is an immediate response to recovery, but it's more longer term than that, and that we actually put things in place that are going to support all of those learners, you know, to go on from school and achieve. You know, and the whole of our NEET community as well, we need to be really aware of that, of how we're going to support those learners that are moving on into work and into employment. And the last thing that's just around that in terms of that long-term impact as well, we are currently developing our Send and Inclusion strategy, and we have identified 6 priorities within that strategy, but actually key that threads right the way across all of those priorities. We have put within about the COVID and recovery and the response to that for all of those learners as well, and the impact on those learners and how best we can support them all the way through. Thank you, Councillor Lamb.
Thank you, Val. So, Councillor Pryor, any reflections from you on the meeting today?
Gosh, kind of coming in at the end, it seems that kind of everything's been said, so I won't speak for too long. But I think the huge takeaway comment, which I think was kind of expressed by some of the young people, and actually where I think that this board could be a huge help and give a huge value added, is looking at the exams kind of next year, the year after, and actually it's been pointed out where we're not entirely sure how long that kind of post-COVID effect is going to be. I think it's really important that we look at kind of not just the stress that young people are going to be having going forward exams when they've had kind of, it'll have been a year, 18 months of disrupted education, but also making sure that kind of children in areas of deprivation, children across the north, children from different backgrounds aren't particularly disadvantaged in those exams going forward. compared to children in other areas. And personally, I think that's an area of work that I think will be really beneficial for the board kind of going into the future. That's my main takeaway. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Pryor. And then Councillor Verner, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much to everyone for all their contributions. It was wonderful to hear from the Youth Council, and also it was great to have a presentation from Vicky from the Youth Service. I don't think Vicky mentioned that, as well as working with the police and LASPACT, youth workers have been seconded into our children's homes over the pandemic, and we absolutely could not have kept those homes open without them. They've been amazing. And I also wanted to reassure members that I know how committed the Youth Service are to getting back out there and getting young people doing fun activities together outside. Two of the highlights of my year last year were when we had a tiny window when we were allowed out, and I did spend half a day with children with additional needs building dens and half a day with children looked after doing archery. They were very patient with my incompetence, but I know how committed they are as soon as we're allowed to get back out there with children in groups, that will be happening. I think the discussion today has made it clear that there are some very predictable impacts of the pandemic, like more children being in poverty and youth unemployment, but also some unknowns. And I was also very struck by the comments around babies and children. I read an article in Children and Young People now a week or so ago about children returning to early years settings who've been out of them. And it talked about children being very distressed at being left by their parents, playing in a very solitary way and not interacting with each other, obsessively washing their hands. And I think people working in early years are going to be presented with things that they haven't seen before. And it will be really important that we keep the bronze meetings that we've got now. We have regular meetings with childminders, people in group settings and wraparound care. Those will keep going, and so will the regular Zoom calls that I host with large numbers of providers so that we can support them with those issues as they come up. I think in the face of the unknowns, it's also really important that services are trauma informed and also remain flexible and open to deal with whatever comes up. And as Joe Mashenko said, the future strategy is being refreshed very much in the context of COVID and the known mental health fallouts and also the unknowns that we will have to respond to. Another thing that's been highlighted and referred to is the need for a whole system response, and I think I'd widen that and say it's a whole city response with the ethos of child-friendly Leeds. And I think what helps us with that is that there is an acknowledgement within society about the impact of the pandemic on children and families and young people, and it is a wide response that we need. Finally, I wanted to highlight a point made by Catherine that I think is really, really important in terms of planning future work, which is that there were inequalities and challenges facing children and young people and families before COVID. And it's really important that we don't lose sight of that preventative work, like our work that was fantastic and internationally recognised around reducing obesity, for example, because as Janice highlighted, that really early investment in preventative work is where you get the best outcomes for children and young people. So I think it's really important that we have to work in the context of COVID and recovery from COVID, but we also need to not lose the work that we were doing around the challenges facing children and young people pre-COVID. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Verner. I see you've got your hand up. I'll bring you in just a second, if that's okay. So in terms of the next steps, in terms of what the work we've done today, the intention was that we produce a scrutiny statement just to capture some of the things that we've heard and some initial recommendations. As we don't have another meeting scheduled this year, the intention is that myself and Angela will draft something initially and then circulate it by correspondence, and we can shape it that way back and forth until we've got something that we're content with. And then out of that, it's as well looking at, which kind of moves us on to item 8, which is the work schedule, which is things that we would want to recommend for our successor board to look at next year. So noting as well, we've still got the piece of work that we were midway through in the pandemic, before the pandemic struck, about exclusions, elective home education, etc. So that still needs to be picked up next year. So just to reassure people, that hasn't been forgotten. But it's also really thinking about the things from today's session that warrant some further work. It's a rapidly changing landscape, and it's going to be a couple of months before the board meets again. Who knows? Well, I don't know if I'll still be in this chair or not, but it's always helpful, I think, for us to have an idea of the sort of things that that a new board can hit the ground running with next year. So with that, Celia, do you want to come in? And then if there's any thoughts or comments from other board members on what they've heard today and things that we might want to look at and recommend going forwards. So Celia.
Yeah, the young people, when they responded to my question, I think, and Councillor Verner actually used the word, anything extracurricular, I think has got to be put forward as fun, because I think the young people and children will have an almost phobic response to extra work that is schoolwork, but not pressure on school staff. Julie mentioned that the school staff are already working under a lot of pressure, doing a great job. But the IT connection, they do need to interact face to face, but there's certainly been a big disadvantage. And I guess it's not just for the young people, children, it's for the families. The families are being disadvantaged in that way. So I don't know if it can be seen in isolation or whether it's part of a bigger picture. That.
Okay, thank you, Celia. Councillor Forsyth, please.
Thank you. This is about possible work going forward. What also got, if you like, had to be put on hold was our work again with the climate emergency, looking at schools as well. Charlotte did mention that right at the end of her introduction when she was here, and I would like us to think about that as a recommendation for work going forward for the next year.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Renshaw, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just noticed from the words that the youth group said that there's also an increase in poverty throughout the city. And so that will impact on our children, young people. So I'd like to continue with the youth service updating us on what they're doing regarding the children, young people that are falling into the poverty trap, because they were already giving support to the young people who were often in those categories through the Youth Matters group. Thank you, Chair.
Yep, no, thank you, Councillor Renshaw. Okay, right, so we're coming to the end of our session. Angela, I don't know if there's anything you want to pick up or just check that you've got everything you need in terms of preparing a statement on behalf of the board.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just to echo what everybody has said, I think it's been a really great comprehensive discussion again today, and appreciating the voice of the young people as well today. So we will obviously look to compile a statement that picks up much of the discussion today, but obviously previous sessions that we've had as well, and that evidence base will help to inform the statement as well.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. I think that is probably one of the most ambitious sessions that we've ever attempted. We've got through a huge amount of work, and I'm incredibly grateful for all of your cooperation and to everybody that's contributed, not least the members of the Youth Council. And it is so important that we actually get the voice of young people, and as Sal and others have said, not only that we listen to what they have to say, but then we make sure that those things are acted upon. And that's a big part of our job, to make sure that those things are followed up and acted upon. So that's what the scrutiny statement will help us to do. If I can thank everybody as well for their incredible contributions across the course of this year, as this is our last meeting. I'm grateful, as always, for such a talented and diverse group of people. It's a pleasure to work with you all, and I'm always so grateful that genuinely we do put politics aside across party and work for the best interests of children and young people. And I think we've done that as well as ever this year, and I'm really grateful for everyone for that. To those elected members who, like me, are up for election this year, I wish you well. I can't wish you all luck, but I do wish you well. But hopefully we'll see lots and lots of familiar faces back around the board table when we get together. And provisionally the date and time of the first meeting for next year is the 9th of June at 10 a.m. That's all to be confirmed. But with that, I thank you all very much indeed, and we can finish the webcast.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Stay healthy.
Goodbye.
Keep well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. I pressed leave once, it didn't leave me.
You've still got your hand up, Karen.